Okay, I'll start. Just a reminder, the final for this class, oh wait, no, that was the earlier part of the day. I was 40 years old when I first went to the Grand Canyon. This was actually an important professional milestone, because when you're talking to people who don't know what geologists do, there are sort of three questions that they have. So, you're a geologist. Have you found any oil? Well, the work I do is more likely to be related to minerals industries, mining, things like that. Oh. So have you found any gold? Well, my work in some of the areas in Alabama and Georgia is in fact in old gold mining districts, but no, I've never found any gold. Well, have you ever been to the Grand Canyon? So you get the picture, right? So I decided to create a Mckee Model to the American Southwest. Perhaps my most creative curriculum endeavor while I've been here. It was offered the first time in 1990, my second year at Centenary, as a survey of some of the national parks and monuments of the southern Colorado Plateau. So many interdisciplinary opportunities are available in such an endeavor because the parks do not focus on just the natural environment. With visits to Bandelier and Mesa Verde, one learns that Santa Fe architecture is not Spanish, but rather a Spanish colonial adaptation of ancestral Puebloan building techniques. A visit to Canyon de Chelly with a Navajo guide introduces you to a different native culture with lots of personal stories about their ways of life and their interactions with Anglos. Our guide regaled us with stories of his activities as an extra, as a Native American extra in many Hollywood movies, and how he learned to fall off of a horse when shot. And then, of course, there's the geology to be seen everywhere you look. Eventually, you start to see how across a 2,000 or so year history, documented by archaeological sites and tree rings, humans have adapted to life in what is, quite frankly, a marginally inhabitable environment. They really understand that this year with the water supply issues out there. Over the many offerings of this course from 1990 to the last offering in 2014, I kept changing things up and putting more emphasis on the intercultural aspects of the class, but one thing remained constant: a visit and hike at the Grand Canyon. The first time I conducted the class in 1990, we spent the first few days around Santa Fe with a campsite at Bandelier National Monument, and then moved toward a hotel shower night in Flagstaff, Arizona. Just east of Flagstaff is the famous Meteor Crater. More commonly known as Meteor Crater, pictured here in a satellite image. We turned off the interstate to take a look. Imagine looking at a 600-foot deep symmetrical hole in the ground that is there because a rock fell out of the sky. It's not a sight you see very often. You begin to understand the processes that produced cratering on the moon. It's an amazing, one-of-a-kind experience. I'd never seen anything like it before. 2 days later, I was standing on the rim of the Grand Canyon, thinking that it sure was big. But there was nothing here that I hadn't encountered before. I grew up in the land of gorges. Both the Genesee and Niagara rivers have carved tremendous gorges over the last 12,500 years or so. In that time, the Niagara River, through the action of Niagara Falls, has carved a 7-mile-long, vertically walled, 180-foot deep gorge. I knew about these processes. As for the stratigraphy, the arrangement of the rocks wasn't all that different from that in other places in the West where I had worked studied, and taught. I was actually kind of disappointed, perhaps even underwhelmed, because I knew what had happened here. Grand Canyon was bigger, but it took longer. No big deal. 2 days later, I dropped over the edge at the head of Bright Angel Trail en route to the Colorado River at the bottom of the canyon. One doesn't need to walk down very far before you realize that big is an insufficient concept when it comes to describing the Grand Canyon. The scale of the canyon, once you are enclosed by its walls, makes you shrink into insignificance very quickly. But in my mind, I was still certain I understood the processes of erosion and mass wasting that had produced the canyon. I came back to Shreveport rather disappointed. I had expected to be enthralled by the canyon, yet I was more impressed by an isolated crater sitting alone in the middle of the plateau. 4 years later, the third instantiation of the plateau module took place, and as luck would have it, I could finally undertake the great adventure I had wanted to take each of the previous trips. I'd wanted to take 2 different trails to hike the canyon, but each of the previous times, rock falls or construction had closed the South Kaibab Trail, which descends to the river and then connects to a trail that leads back to the Bright Angel Trail so that a loop hike can be completed. Our previous ventures had both descended to the river and come back out on the Bright Angel Trail, the trail that you see on the left there as you're looking at it. The Bright Angel Trail is what is known to canyon hikers as a drainage trail. That is, it's located in a valley associated with one of the small tributaries that flow from the rim to the Colorado River. Views of the canyon are really restricted by the valley walls. The South Kaibab Trail, on the other hand, is a ridge trail. You get much more expansive views of the canyon when you're hiking down a ridge because you can look left or right up and down the canyon. To get the greatest appreciation for the canyon and its diversity of landscapes, the loop hike, although slightly longer, is the way to go. There are drawbacks. The principal one being there is no place to replenish water supplies until you're 12 miles into the trip on your way out of the canyon on the Bright Angel Trail. Planning is essential. Everything would have been fine, except it seems there was a stomach bug that was going around the group and no one wanted to tell me about it for fear that I would cancel or severely shorten the hike. Well, we all made it to the base of the Bright Angel Trail for lunch, sat down by the river, and when I was finished, I started up the trail and told them I'd be waiting for them at Indian Gardens, the first water stop on the way out, and would stay there until everyone had passed so that I knew where they were. About 2/3 of the group had passed when a student came by and told me that one of our group was sick about a mile back down the canyon. I walked back down the canyon to check on the student and assess the situation, and thought it best to get the person back to Indian Gardens where there's water and shade and, as luck would have it, an emergency clinic. To get a better assessment of the situation, after about half an hour at Indian Gardens with no improvement for my hiker, I went to the clinic to get the ranger on duty who came down and got the suffering soul back up to the clinic. It was about 2:30 in the afternoon, and had I left then, I would have reached the top of the trail and exited the canyon about 5:15 or 5:30. At 6 o'clock, the ranger decided the hiker wasn't going to recover sufficiently at the clinic and called the medevac helicopter. By the way, if you have the right insurance company, It's simply an ambulance trip. So at 6:15, I started the 4.5-mile, 2.5 to 3 hour hike to the Bright Angel Trailhead on the south rim, and it was already dusk. I was rather glad I'd put in an order for a full moon that night, because the light of a beautiful full moon and some muscle memory from having hiked the trail twice before, I managed the hike successfully with a rare situation of moonlight hiking to heighten the experience. For those of you who are old enough to remember some Cat Stevens lyrics, yes, I have been followed by a moon shadow. When I exited about 9:15, all I wanted was water, food, and a rest after my 18.5 miles of hiking with about 4,700 feet change in elevation. When I got back to our campsite, everyone was there, including my distressed hiker, who after an IV and food was now feeling perfectly fine. The next day was a scheduled recovery and laundry day, so after a late start in the morning, we went into Grand Canyon Village to do laundry, visit some of the sites along the rim, and shop for food to take back to camp for dinner. While the others were browsing in shops and museums, I took my exhausted, aching self over to sit among some trees just off the rim trail where I could be in the shade but still see the canyon. When I woke up, or at least came back to some sense of awareness, I found myself looking at a canyon that in fact I knew very little about. I'd been deluding myself thinking that knowing the stratigraphy and structure, along with knowing the processes by which the rivers erode their valleys and the valleys are widened, that I knew about the canyon. Questions were running through my mind. How wide was the upper part of the canyon when the river began to cut down to form the inner gorge? Had the river carved a level place there before it began a second phase of downcutting? Had tributaries that now go all the way down to the river level been there before the incision of the inner gorge, or are they later features? During the changing hydraulic conditions over the ice ages, how had the stream flow and downcutting of the river varied? I knew that techniques existed and new ones were being developed that could help understand the history of the river deepening its valley, but the history of valley widening was likely to remain a mystery, as was the river's flow rate. You see, erosion loves to destroy evidence. My mind was unsettled by the idea that something I wanted to know was probably an unanswerable question. As it turns out, the idea of unanswerable questions that on the surface seem to be reasonably straightforward scientific questions occurs in geology more than one might wish. The incompleteness of the stratigraphic record, particularly true for terrestrial systems which are largely erosional, was recognized by Darwin when he was confronted with the absence of intermediate forms. 50 years before, the numerous erosional surfaces in the tertiary sections of the Paris Basin caused Georges Cuvier to posit multiple creation events to explain the differences in the vertebrate faunas from one layer to the next. Both of these superb scientists were dealing with the data being destroyed by geologic processes. In 1967, in his address as outgoing president of the Geological Society of America, Konrad Krauskopf confronted the idea that some of our geologic questions that sound perfectly plausible are in fact meaningless, because either there is no way of getting data to answer them, or they're the result of a random event, or as he suggested, because the orderliness of nature that we as scientists attempt to decipher is partly an illusion. And I might suggest that the question I raised above about river flow is an example of this second possibility. Eventually, the chaos theorists might get us a step closer to understanding weather and climate patterns, but I actually don't hold out much hope. In Crosskop's study, he was arguing that field relations that could be observed were insufficient to determine the number and sequence of a variety of granite bodies in the Inyo Mountains in California, even suggesting that further research, in this case getting radiometric ages, would still not provide sufficient resolution to answer the questions. One might say that the repeated events of granite intrusion had destroyed the data, the field relations, needed to resolve the question of number and sequence. On an even larger scale, the process of plate tectonics, so necessary to understanding how the Earth works, destroys ancient oceans through the process of subduction. A few scraps of material interpreted as oceanic lithosphere trapped in older mountain ranges are our only physical evidence of what oceanic crust older than about 250 million years ago might have looked like. Geology, the science of destroyed evidence. I would point out that geology isn't the only discipline to suffer from the inability to get comprehensive answers to questions. In October of 2001, I had the pleasure of attending the Science and Spiritual Quest conference at Harvard. The conveners, all from the Center for the Study of Theology and the Natural Sciences at Berkeley, had assembled an array of panelists from all over the world and representing a wide range of spiritual traditions. One of these speakers was William Newsom, distinguished professor of neuroscience at Stanford. Newsom's research involved training monkeys to identify whether a pencil in their line of sight moved up or down. He then removed a portion of the monkey's skull and, using electrodes to stimulate parts of the cortex to discover the area connected to the monkey's observation and response by making the monkey give the incorrect answer. In other words, he was exploring in fine detail some of the regionalization of brain function. But he then described a conundrum that he couldn't solve. Would the monkey say, "It was going up, just like I told you"? Or would the monkey say, "I saw it moving down. I don't know why I said up"? He was at a loss to know whether he had altered the monkey's perception or the monkey's motor response. I'm sure others of you might be able to think of questions in your own disciplines where the answers seem to be just out of reach and yet may lie infinitely far away. So what is one to do when confronted with the unknowable? There are basically two choices. You can throw your hands in despair and move on to something else. Or one could accept the limitation or even embrace it and take the challenge of finding out what one can know within the limits that nature has dictated. At the time, I was particularly concerned with the question about the discharge history of the river, the stream flow question mentioned above. One of my teaching assignments was undergraduate and graduate level hydrology, and one of the early homework problems dealt with a peak annual discharge frequency analysis at Lee's Ferry in the Grand Canyon, right at the northeast head of what is now Grand Canyon National Park. The data set covered the years from 1896, when a stream gauging station was built as part of the national program, to 1956, when the natural flow was first altered for the construction of Glen Canyon Dam. So I began to explore what was known and what sort of planning went into the decisions to advance the Big Dams project that led to the construction of Hoover Dam from 1931 to 36, authorized by Congress in 1928, and eventually to the construction of the Glen Canyon Dam and a third dam on the Green River near the Utah-Wyoming border. The stream gauging network that included the Lee's Ferry Station gave rise to a large data set that was analyzed by E.C. LaRue and several colleagues at the U.S. Geological Survey and published in a series of water supply papers between 1916 and 1925 that provided a comprehensive management plan that I refer to as the Small Dams Project, as it proposed a number of small dams to meet relatively local needs for irrigation and power generation, as well as for larger downstream flood control. This was also the data set that led to the Big Dam proposal developed by the Bureau of Reclamation that finally won congressional approval in the 1928 authorization of Hoover Dam. I presented a paper on the USGS model and how it was consonant with the watershed scale model proposals that had been made by John Wesley Powell in his 1878 report on the arid lands of the West. I gave this paper at a special symposium at the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C., the oldest sort of think tank in D.C. And it was a symposium celebrating the 125th anniversary of the founding Cosmos Club, and what many regarded as the most important work by the club's founder, the aforementioned Arid Lands Report by John Wesley Powell. But where did Powell have information in 1878 that led him to his proposals? It was time now for some digging into the story of John Wesley Powell and his two expeditions down the Colorado River, the first in 1869 and the second spanning 1871 and 1872. I began with the best available biography of Powell that was available at the time, Wallace Stegner's Beyond the 100th Meridian. I was spooked a bit at first. Powell was born in Mount Morris, New York, a small town outside of Rochester, New York. I was born and raised in a small town outside of Rochester, New York. When young Wes's dad, a very liberal abolitionist Methodist minister, decided to send his son to college, he sent him to a small school in Ohio that was the oldest integrated coeducational institution in the world, called Oberlin College. And yes, indeed, my undergraduate degree was awarded by Oberlin College. Later in his career, John Wesley Powell was appointed the first geology professor at the Illinois Technological Institute, which later became the University of Illinois, where in fact I earned my PhD. After recovering from these coincidences and wondering if fate had led me to this point, I realized I needed to go to the original materials, the journals of the people who had been, as it were, the staff scientists on the Second River Expedition. Without going into detail, in several of those journals were the first hydrologic data collected for the Colorado River, simple estimates of current velocity, and estimates of how high floodwaters had reached up the walls of the canyons. And that was it. That was all the data Powell had to work with before the installation of the gauging network established in 1895. Further work with the journals led me to some other projects, including the transcription of an unpublished set of field notes, a project that will occupy some time in the next year, and a presentation on the impact, or rather the lack thereof, of the canyon exploration on the religious views of the participants. But those other questions kept lurking in the back of my mind as I returned to some work on metamorphism in the Alabama Appalachians. And I still wanted answers because I kept taking students back to the mysterious canyon. Then in 2005, a book was published entitled Grand Canyon, Solving Earth's Grandest Puzzle. It's truly a wonderful exploration of the history of scientific ideas around the evolution of the canyon, written by James Lawrence Powell, no relation to John Wesley so far as I know, but coincidentally, and I'm sorry if this seems incestuous, my undergraduate advisor at Oberlin. So stealing a bit from Jim Powell, let's take a look at what we knew up to a little after 2000. And then we'll look at a bit more recent work to see what we actually do know about the formation of Grand Canyon and the history of the Colorado River. First, we'll look at a map of the Colorado River and note a few things about it. Starting in north central Colorado, right in behind Rocky Mountain National Park, the river, first known as the Grand River, makes its way across Colorado, carving a canyon where it crosses a mountain ridge at Glenwood Springs, collects some additional power and supply where various tributaries enter, notably the Gunnison, which has carved its own spectacular Grand Black Canyon, and enters into Utah, where it makes its way through the town of Moab to a meeting with the Green River coming out of the Wind River Mountains of Wyoming. There, the two join forces in Canyonlands National Park. A new river is formed that was the original Colorado. It was an extravagant petition and testimony to a congressional committee in 1925 that encouraged them to change the name of the Grand so that people in Congress from Colorado could actually claim that the Colorado River was in Colorado. This river makes its way in seemingly normal fashion past the junction with the San Juan down to Lee's Ferry. At that point, the river does a big U-shaped bend, first going south and then swinging northwest, and then turn southwest again, only to do another big U-shaped bend as it gets closer to what is now the head of Lake Mead. Then it passes through a few small squiggles, makes a right-angle bend to start its final journey to the Sea of Cortez, or the Gulf of California to us Americans. Those two U's and the right-angle bend are very unusual paths for rivers, unless there's something else exerting a control on their courses. We're going to be concerned about the first U. We'll let others worry about the rest of it. The eastern bend goes around a feature known as the Kaibab Plateau. The Colorado Plateau has various uplifted and downdropped blocks that make up a variety of interesting features. In another part of the plateau, the Monument Upwarp, which holds the features of Monument Valley, is but one example. If you Google Monument Valley, you'll be sure to recognize it, unless you've never seen a Western. Many of them were shot there. Of those blocks in the southern Colorado Plateau, the Kaibab Plateau has been pushed up the most. We geologists would say it is the structurally highest block. It may not be the highest in elevation because so much has been eroded from off the top, but the Kaibab limestone is never farther above sea level than it is on the Kaibab Plateau. In the most dramatic exit from Grand Canyon National Park, you leave the park by the east entrance, heading toward US 89. You drop down 3,200 feet in getting to the town of Cameron. And at that point, the top of the Kaibab limestone, which is beneath you under some Triassic sedimentary rocks, is more than 4,000 feet lower than at the top of the Kaibab Plateau. Think about it. More than 3/4 of a mile drop across a single fault. Clearly, a formidable barrier for any river to cross. In the Western Canyon, the river goes around another uplifted block, the Shivwitz Plateau, which poses a similar problem, although its setting is not quite so dramatic as the approach to the Kaibab when coming from the east. So how did the river and its canyon come to be with these sort of peculiar quirks? That turns out to be a quintessentially American geological question. Geomorphology, the study of landscapes and their evolution, was developed as a branch of geological studies by G.K. Gilbert and William Morris of the USGS and William Morris Davis of Harvard University in the late 1880s and 1890s. But it was born when John Wesley Powell asked questions about the age relationships between rivers and the structures they crossed on the Colorado Plateau. 60 years ago, in days pre-plate tectonics, the analysis of rivers and landscapes occupied about half of every introductory geology course. And if you pick up an introductory geology text these days, more of it is devoted to plate tectonics and its effect than to the study of landscapes. The revolution in geology over that time period changed our approach to the science. Jim Powell records the development of the ideas that Gilbert and Morris and Davis have, and other early workers in the first part of his book, and wading through them right now wouldn't advance my story. So I'll pick the story up with a prelude to a conference held in 1864 to discuss the problems of the formation of the Grand Canyon. The early workers had thought the river was old. As the structures grew up under it, it carved its way through them. But this interpretation had some problems. Why didn't it just cut through the Kaibab and the Shivwitz rather than go around them? Some upstream sections of the river seem to be older than the downstream sections. That conflicts with what we know about how rivers develop. And there was evidence that no river had exited the west end of the Grand Canyon until about 5 million years ago. The 1964 conference tried to address these questions by gathering around a preliminary model developed by E.D. Mckee that's shown in a set of images here. In the image on the left side, you see two streams. An ancestral Little Colorado River and a Hualapai drainage network. The Hualapai drainage network is small but actively extending the length of its course. It is also internally drained, meaning that all of the streams flow toward some central point. There's no exit for water from the basin. In the right side diagram, the Hualapai, through a process we call headward erosion, the lengthening of a stream as it pushes its course upstream, has been trapped in a weak layer in the folded nose of the Kaibab uplift, and has followed that weak layer around the end, forming our U-shaped bend and continuing its headward path until it intersects the south-flowing ancestral Little Colorado River and captures its upstream part. That would have greatly increased the volume of water flowing in the Hualapai drainage, and carving of a canyon could have proceeded at a much more rapid rate. And about 5 million years ago, something happened so that the river could escape through the west end and head down to the Sea of Cortez. And much more rapid downcutting carved the canyon that we see today, as shown in this diagram. Mckee's model isn't particularly specific about what happened at the west end, nor the ages of the three stages that are shown. But it solves the problem of some of the upstream canyon being older than the downstream canyon, and provides a nifty solution to the Kaibab bend. It's so nifty that most other models have included some notion of the importance of headward erosion to develop the quirks of the river's course. There wasn't much that prohibited the model from being possible, but unfortunately, there wasn't much data to support it either. Well, there's nothing like a good model to spur more research. And by 1990, a great deal of work had been done. Of first importance was the fact that the plate tectonic model had become widely accepted, and the capture of Baja California by the Pacific Plate, opening up the Sea of Cortez, gave a process and a time frame for the western Colorado River to make its exit and its way to the sea, helping confirm the earlier interpretation that some of the Grand Canyon had been carved in the last 5 million years. But an idea had emerged that pre-Colorado drainage went toward the north, not the west or the south. Before the uplift of the Colorado Plateau, high ground was to the south and west, and gravels exist north of the canyon that look suspiciously like they were derived from this elevated area. It was discovered that Peachtree Canyon in the western Grand Canyon contained a record of a significant 18 million year old north-flowing stream. Geologist Ivo Lukita proposed that after finding its way around the Kaibab Plateau, the ancestral Colorado had continued to the north or northwest, rather than bending around to its more southwesterly course. Techniques using cosmogenic nuclides can be used to determine how long a rock surface has been exposed, as well as some creative geology using more conventional data techniques and applying them to old lava flows, were being used to determine the rate at which the river could cut down through the rock. All of these new studies were brought together in a symposium volume published in 2001 and summarized for the general reader quite nicely by Powell in his book. The symposium introduced some intriguing possibilities and new models, but failed to resolve the outstanding issues. In fact, just the opposite had happened. More questions arose than were answered, and figuring out how the Colorado River came to be the way it is seemed more elusive than ever. An unanswerable question. A second symposium was convened in 2010. The scope of the symposium was expanded to include more context by including work on the whole Colorado Plateau, more data on incision rates, more information about older north-trending drainages, which were features of the symposium, along with better data for the Delta region after the connection to the Sea of Cortez. Several authors discussed the possibility of and evidence for Paleo Grand Canyons. In the summary of the symposium volume, the conveners identified 13 points on which some level of consensus had been reached, 12 points that remained continuing controversies, and 14 points for continued research. In many cases, Krauskopf's claim that there are some problems for which further data will not clarify the situation seems to be hanging over the heads of the workers. Let's take a brief look at two of the ideas that were put forth in that symposium volume, one by William Rainey and co-workers, and one by Brian Wernicke, as they go to some of the questions from my 1994 Day on the Rim. The next four images are from Rainey's paper in the symposium volume and show his maps for what he thinks happened. There we are about 30 million years ago. We see what looks like McKee's Hualapai drainage in the west, internally drained. We see some other streams. We see a lot of streams that are flowing north to northeast. We don't see a Grand Canyon. Between 11 and 6 million years ago, Rainey thinks that headward erosion by the Hualapai drainage, instead of finding a weak layer in the nose of the Kaibab Arch, finds its way through an ancient cave system and works its way back through and connects to the Little Colorado on the other side, integrating that part of the Colorado River. And then finally, after the opening of the Sea of Cortez, we see the modern Colorado. Everybody agree on that? No. It remains a model. This is some of the work from Brian Wernicke. Wernicke has focused on the down-cutting history of the river. And one of the interesting things that he shows in the last two columns there is, in fact, the idea that at 16 million years ago, the Colorado River had cut all the way through the upper part of the canyon that we hike through on Bright Angel Trail. That the incision that occurred as the Colorado made its way to the sea after the opening at the west end only carved the inner gorge. You may recall that one of the questions I had when I woke up was there a two-stage process to make this? Why was the upper part of the canyon so distinct from the lower part of the canyon? And yeah, this is kind of an interesting solution to that. So here we are. Perhaps we've reached some clarification on how the course of the river came to be what is today. And we know a lot more about the river and its tributaries when it comes to downcutting. But we're still no closer to my being able to sit at Powell Point and draw some sketches to say, here's what the canyon looked like at various times. That question is not just out of reach. We're as far from answering it now as we were when I asked it 28 years ago. It still seems unanswerable because, yes, erosion has carried all the evidence away. The canyon still holds great mysteries for scientists many years into the future. So what are the lessons the Grand Canyon taught me? Powell summarizes 3 important geological lessons from the Grand Canyon, but I'm not sure those are the important ones. The first thing I learned from the Grand Canyon was a little bit about humility. All that we think we might know may not prepare us for every situation. Yes, I'd studied geomorphology, but there was a certain amount of arrogance involved in thinking when I looked in the canyon that I understood everything that was happening. I've learned to approach problems with a sense of humility because of my experience at the canyon. 2, the unanswerable question is not useless. In fact, being able to recognize the unanswerable question is powerful, because you can use the unanswerable question to help clarify the questions that do have answers and the directions that research may need to go to help advance the study of the particular topic. The other thing I've learned is patience. The answer may come or it may not. But more often than not, if it comes, you need to wait with some patience to get to it. I'd be remiss if I didn't make one more comment about that day in 1994. When those questions raced through my mind, I wasn't sure where they were coming from. For a brief moment, I touched something bigger. Call it the mind of the universe, if you will. The sense that there was something out there that remembered what happened here. It was overwhelming, and it changed my life in many ways. You know, I've never been back to Meteor Crater. Not once. It's a hole in the ground because a big rock fell out of the sky. Co-workers in that field have provided perfectly adequate explanations for it. And yet, when I'm driving the road toward the south entrance to Grand Canyon National Park, just past the intersection of the road that comes from Flagstaff up over the flank of the San Francisco Peaks, there's a point where I got my first glimpse of the Coconino Sandstone on the North Rim. My chest tightens, my throat swells, tears start to well up, because I know I'm at a place where I can celebrate both what I know and what I may never know. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it very much. It's been a great ride for 34 years. And you and the students are who have made it all worth it. So thank you.